Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for all who have joined us, and thank you to our panelists for what they're going to share with us as it relates to how social innovation can really address some of the key education inequalities of our day. My name is Gary Painter, and I'm the director of the Price Center for Social Innovation, as well as the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. Our mission at the Price Center for Social Innovation is to develop ideas and illuminate strategies to improve the quality of life for people living in low-income urban communities. And we actually accomplish this mission through teaching, research, and working with community partners. It is our 10th anniversary of the Price Center for Social Innovation. And so as such, we're really excited to celebrate with you. And in so doing, this event is the second in a series of our 10th anniversary social innovation summits. As we celebrate this anniversary, we are focusing on issues of how social innovation can catalyze systemic change in criminal justice, education, and housing insecurity, I should say, which are three of the Price Center's core research areas. Our next event is going to take place on April 13th, and we'll focus on the intersection between housing instability and social innovation. If you haven't received that invitation, you can find it right on our website. Then I wanted to note that we're going to come together in person. While the first three of our 10th anniversary summits are actually, as you experienced today, over Zoom, we're going to conclude by having a fireside chat with former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro. In addition to serving as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, was the mayor of San Antonio and was most recently a Democratic candidate for president. Please go to the website to register for both of these events. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce the moderator and framer of today's discussion, my colleague Christine Beckman, who serves both as an associate director of the Price Center for Social Innovation, and she also holds the Price Family Chair in Social Innovation. You can read her full bio on the event page. For now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Beckman and our panelists today. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gary. Glad to be having this discussion today. I'm going to do a very brief overview, but I'm not going to talk too long because we've got three terrific panelists, and I want to make sure that we give them as much time to share all of the exciting things that are happening in the education space in social innovation. So as Gary said, this is our second session in honor of our 10th anniversary here. And I thought I'd start by just telling you how we think about what do we mean when we say social innovation. It's a word that sort of has a long history. Sort of I put here on the slide sort of the very first definition that I like from way back in 2003. All right, it's about inventing, securing support for, and implementing novel solutions to social needs and problems. And I think that's important because it's both about the novelty, about the support, and today we have some people funding important social innovations, and then implementing and scaling and growing new ideas. So that is sort of, we think of social innovation as all of those pieces. And at the center of the definition we lean on is focused on iteration. It focuses on inclusivity and effective solutions, but also just solutions for complex social problems. So all of those are elements that we think are particularly important in the social innovation space, all very relevant to what we're going to be talking about today: justice, inclusion, scaling, growth, iteration. And social innovation emerges often because our traditional approaches sort of haven't created the systemic change that we want. We see inequality in all sorts of ways, and the social innovation is an alternative to the sort of our traditional models of solving problems. Not the only model, but one that we think has a lot of promise. And we sort of developed this picture here, sort of what we call the social innovation process. And it sort of focuses sort of on all the pieces that I think we focus on. First being sort of co-production and the importance of sort of individuals sort of being involved in the process from the beginning to the end. So in education we might think about what's the role of teachers and students in developing and understanding social problems. Parents. Think about piloting, experimenting with new ideas, iterating, and once we find good ideas, sort of scaling them growing them, and then diffusion. When I think about diffusion, I think about the eventual goal of the social innovation process is to solve inequities in the system, to really to engage in systemic change. And so often we can see an idea scale and grow, but not necessarily be able to change the system in which it's operating. And so when we think about diffusion, we think about what are the ways in which the new ideas and processes can be embedded in the system and change the way a system operates and help it operate in a more equitable and just fashion. A tall order, right? And certainly not all of our innovations ever get there, but that's the intent and the hope, I think, in a social innovation process, is to actually change the system in which we're operating. I'm going to start with, I'd say a few words about charter schools, mostly because that's the space in the education world that I've done a little bit of research and have the most experience. And when the field of social innovation first emerged, it was one of the most common examples of social innovation. We might talk about microfinance, we might talk about fair trade, and we would often talk about charter schools as an exemplar of a social innovation. For those of you that don't know a lot about charter schools, I'm sure there are some of you here. Right, charter schools are publicly funded schools in the K-12 space, and what they are is they're schools that have been sort of freed from a number of regulations with the idea that they're going to experiment with innovative ideas to improve learning and be held accountable for, in terms of the performance of their students. In California, every 5 years, schools are evaluated and their charters approved if the results are extended, if the results are good. So they are publicly funded schools, but they're operating sort of outside of a formal district in many cases. Like many things in the world today, there's a lot of politics and a lot of controversy about all sorts of ideas. Charter schools were originally, when they were first created, supported by both sides of the political spectrum. It was an interesting convergence of left and right. In California, the legislation passed to approve charter schools in 1992. So we've had 30 years of an experiment in California, one of the earlier states in the nation to have charter schools. So that's sort of what charter schools are. And I sort of want to highlight from a social innovation perspective, why do we think of them as a social innovation? I think it's important to think about, especially as we move to this conversation, it's not just about schools, but about sort of in charter schools, sort of the form itself, like that it is created out of legislation. It is created with an idea of experimentation and innovation. Accountability happens in a different way than it happens for a traditional a district school around performance and clarity of the education model. And really a goal of expanding opportunities for academically low achieving students. So the legislation both wanted to improve opportunities for students and also experiment with new and innovative methods of pedagogy. And then also, I think appealed to people from a local control community school choice perspective. And as I said, it's supported by a range of actors sort of initially. And so from a social innovation perspective, you see a lot of experimentation, you see a lot of piloting, you see a lot of attempts to scale and grow. And I think it's important to say both the promise as well as I think some of the roadblocks have come up. So improving educational opportunities, sort of really helping low-income students, experimentation, innovation, those would be sort of on the promise side, and being able to customize to local context. There are a lot of parent-driven schools or community-driven schools, and I think when you get to sort of the top end of the model around sort of diffusion, I think that's where you see sort of some of the challenges. It's difficult to scale successful models. There are a charter school is not one thing, but many, many things by design, right? There's a lot of experimentation. And so, charter models have a multitude of different outcomes. And the idea originally of charter schools was that it was going to create ideas that can diffuse to all sorts of other types of schools, to district schools, and sort of improve the educational system writ large. And I would argue, and our panelists may disagree with me, that hasn't happened as much as we would like. There has been much more school focused and much less ecosystem and system focused. So I think one of the roadblocks that I think we continue to work to think about and worry about in the education space. And then I think the other thing that maybe this is going to lead me to pivot into my first question is a lot of these early charter schools were founded by people really interested in helping sort of low-income communities. The leadership itself wasn't often as diverse as the students they served, and so all sorts of questions around racial equity sort of have come up in this space as well. So I that's really all I want to say is sort of what charters are, sort of what the promise and sort of what the constraints are. I think all of our panelists today have experience with charter schools, but the nice thing is that that's not the only thing they know about. They know a lot about a lot of other important social innovations and efforts to improve our educational system. There's sort of the next, I'm really excited to hear about the next generation of investments and opportunities, whether that be about equitable design or things we might do for teachers, thinking about governance, cities and systems. And so I want to introduce to you our three panelists, Marlon Marshall, who is a partner at City Fund. Marlon spent some time very involved in the Obama White House on public engagement, and the City Fund sort of works. I'll let him talk more about what his organization does, but thinking about cities, right? Thinking about public schools sort of in the context of particular cities. And we have Francis Massano, who's president and the incoming CEO of New Schools Venture Fund, a venture philanthropy fund that sort of invests $45 million annually in a range of educational funds. She's been at New Schools Venture Fund for 7 years, previously, which was at Teach for America, early in her career, which sort of one of the sources for many education reformers in the education space. Julie McCood, our third panelist, also has a background at Teach for America. She is the co-president of the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies, focused on the K-12 education portfolio, focused on teachers and students. In addition to Teach for America, Julie also spent time at New Schools Venture Fund. So we have a lot of people sort of been very, very active in this space for a very long period of time, and really glad to have you all three here. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can make sure everyone can see your faces most of all. So I wanted to start. The first question here for you is, so I think overall, what I want to do is I want to think about where have we been, where are we going, what are the opportunities? But before starting backwards, it might be useful to start with where we are. I mean, it's been a couple years with so many different things that have happened. We've had a pandemic which closed schools. We've had a movement around social justice, which has raised all sorts of conversations that hadn't been front and center. We've had a lot of politicization of the dialogue and sort of the environment around schools, from school boards to curriculum, right? So there's a lot of things that have happened in the last couple of years that have an impact, presumably, on your work and how you think about social innovation. So Marlon, can I ask you to start? Sort of, tell us a little bit about how the last couple of years has influenced sort of what's happening in schools and how you think about social innovation.
It's good to be with you guys today. Marlon Marshall, I'm a partner at the City Fund. We invest in organizations in about 15 cities across the country that are both opening, supporting nonprofit schools, such as charter schools, but also innovation schools. And then on the C4 side, supporting folks who are interested in running for office. There's local C4 organizations that are doing that, and also just doing advocacy around school policy, things of that nature at the local level as well, too. I think your question is a good one. So like you said, Christine, I come from politics, and I'm a big believer in political windows. And I believe we are in the midst of a political window right now. I worked on campaigns since a little bit before 2004, starting with the John Kerry race in 2004 for president. And never have I seen education be such a major voting issue as it is today. It was part of the elections that happened in Virginia recently. I was one of the driving forces. Obviously, I think the pandemic drove a lot of those feelings. And now you have a variety of things between choice, but also things that are getting mixed in with that, with critical race theory and other components as well too. And all that to me just means I think the pandemic has highlighted many of the systemic inequalities in our system that have existed for decades. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, just 8 miles from Ferguson. We all know what happened there many years ago, which I think is not necessarily directly related to the education system, but is an example of the inequalities that exist in our country. My mom was a teacher in St. Louis public school system and made very different choices for me because of what she wasn't able to do and the resources she wasn't able to get in that school system, and the lack of choice that many parents, particularly many parents of colors, do not have in these cities across the country. So I think the last couple of years have just really exposed that for folks. My concern, if I'm being candid, is while I think we have a window to make big change, I worry that change could get directed in the wrong way. I'm personally a proponent of teaching about race in school and teaching about the real history of the United States of America. And I worry we're going to veer off that versus thinking about structurally, what do we need to do to provide parents with more options and support to be able to pick the school that's best for them? How do we pay our teachers a living wage, more than a living wage, a fair wage for the work that they do and support them? I'm on the board of a charter school here in Denver, Colorado, which is where I live. And we just made decisions that we can do as a charter school that many public schools can't, to actually do more performance pay and do more raises for our top performing teachers into the six figures. That is unheard of in teaching, which should be, frankly, one of the first things we're thinking about, that floor in terms of six figures. So I think we're in a moment for lots of change. I hope that we can drive that change into ways that really fix the system and away from some of the politics that are starting to affect this conversation that we're having today.
So Julie, that's what I'm going to pick up with you, because I think, I'm thinking about curriculum, thinking about teachers, thinking about the politicization. So how do you think about, have you changed your strategy in the last couple of years? Is anything about the way you invest and think about tackling these problems what do you think and do differently now?
Hi, all. Nice to be with you. Julie McCood with the Schusterman Family Philanthropies. I have this weird title of co-president. So just to center, my context is, while I'm lead the education team, we also have work that is in criminal justice, voting rights, gender reproductive equity, support for the state of Israel as a democratic state, and support for Jewish leadership. And across all, there's a racial equity framing. So I say this because I think one of the things that's happened in education over the past couple of years, in addition to what Marlon has just talked about, is we see the interconnectivity of education with other systems. And I think there's really opportunities for innovation as we think about finally looking beyond just the school system walls about what's influencing who shows up in our classrooms, to beyond that. And I'll just say that, when I think about where we are now and going into, Christine, your question, 1 in every 350 young person under the age of 18 lost a primary caregiver to COVID. And that's disproportionately hit communities of color. We saw the child tax credit come in and reduce child poverty by 40%, and now that's gone away. So now we're seeing the same numbers already plunging back. And so as we think about what's happening and where we're headed, and our core is really on the teaching and the instructional core, we also think about students who missed a lot of skills in their schools, but at the same time, a lot of students also built some new strengths. They went out and they did a lot of good self-directed learning. They found things they were interested in. They chose not to engage in some cases because the content was not good enough. And I'm sure a lot of folks who looked over their shoulders or over themselves in those situations said, this isn't good enough for me. Like, why am I showing up? And so when we think about the work, we really are anchoring much more on the student experience. And I think there's so much room here for innovation about what is the student experience? What would make a kid keep coming to school and keep engaged day in and day out on the materials and the projects that they're given? So as we think about that, we think about this through the lens of, what does that mean for instructional materials? What does that mean for who is teaching? And to Marlon's point, making sure that you are affirming kids' identity, which means you've got to talk about race, you've got to talk about our history as a way to just be able to a broker towards more of a bipartisan and more of a collective leadership in the country, but also because that's what matters most to kids as they're trying to figure out their own identity and go through. So we have shifted from a framing of what is a quality education from one that was very much standards aligned to one that is still standards aligned, that is rigorous, There are great concepts within the Common Core standards, which is what we anchor on around thinking together, working together to solve problems. But we're also expanding to say affirming education and high levels of engagement plus the standards alignment is what we now anchor on in terms of a definition of quality education. And I'll come back and talk about politics because I've taken up a lot of airtime. I want to hear from Francis.
Terrific. All right, Francis. Yeah, New Schools Venture Fund has been in this space for a while. Love to hear your perspective on where we are now.
Yeah, happy to share more. And just, I think I appreciate what you just shared, Julie, and I can pick up from that too. Like, I want to say yes to all of that in terms of the framing of how do we really anchor on the student experience. But I think that really starts with really anchoring on who our students are. Right. We know that more than 50% of US public school students identify as being of color. Right. And so when we think about what that means then in terms of the affirming environments that we need to create, it does raise all of the issues that Julie mentioned of what is being taught, making sure an accurate history is being taught, making sure that given all of the inequities that were laid bare during the pandemic, we now can no longer ignore them. We know that there have been students of color, low-income students who are learning English, students who might identify as having a learning difference who have been overlooked. And we have not created school environments, products, curriculum, or even trained up teachers, educators in a way that's going to meet their needs. And so I feel like the work that we're talking about now is we need to make sure that we are focused on all the students who have been furthest behind for opportunity, which is to say, we have always focused on supporting early stage innovators in education. We've always done that in funding both new charter schools and new district schools, new education technology approaches, new content, new curriculum, as well as had a deep focus on diverse leadership. And so a thing that I would say is like in our last year, as an example, 70% of the people we funded, so we funded 118 organizations, 70% of those organizations were led by people of color. So I think a huge thing that we're doing is also focused on making sure that we're funding people who are reflective of the students that we seek to serve, because we think they bring much needed insights, as well as improved outcomes for students. And so the changes and the shifts that we've been making over the last years, we've deepened our focus on racial equity. We've decided to launch a new investment area that uses participatory grant making as a practice so that we can really make sure that we are thinking about how we both share power, seed power, and reimagine how we are making decisions in philanthropy. We've deepened our focus on areas such as mental health, understanding that mental health and well-being is critical and an area that requires a lot more focus, both in terms of support that's provided to students as well as to educators. We are also thinking more about how can we focus on innovations that are needed in the talent sphere. I think the thing that we've all kind of talked about very, 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 very briefly, and we can spend more time on it, is we know that the job of a teacher has been unsustainable, and it's especially been unsustainable over the last 2 years, but we're asking teachers to do far too much in the one role, right? We actually need to reimagine how we think about the role of the teacher, and we need to reimagine the role of adults of all kinds and how they can power the future of education. And I think parents are prominent in that. So focusing more on parents and the role of parents, not just as caregivers, but as partners, full partners in education, and the full range of ways in which that can show up has been another focus area. And the way that we're doing it is like, how can we be more responsive, not just in having our kind of structured investment areas or structured strategy, but think about the ways in which we need to be more responsive in the money we're allocating and how we're allocating those dollars, because the ground is shifting underneath our feet. And we can't wait to have perfect strategies to then be able to then decide where the money goes. We need to follow the energy and make sure that we're supporting innovators across the country to do their best work.
But I think hearing about some of those ideas, some of the things you're excited that you're seeing, I think for all of you, I think would be really useful for our audience sort of to hear about. So I don't know who would want to start. I mean, I guess from Julie, I'm sort of curious, sort of both teachers. Teachers in particular, I know is something that you think a lot about. What are there places, programs? Like, what are you excited about? How do we sort of reimagine what this looks like for teachers and students?
Yeah, I think it's I mean, like I said, we're the teacher, our tagline is sometimes we heart teachers. And I think a lot of folks have to heart teachers right now because, as Frances said, it's a super hard job in terms of just everything and how much teachers had on their hands while they were challenged to deliver in a lot of cases virtual and then hybrid, and now catching kids up and also making sure that they are a caretaker for students who show up in front of them. So a couple of things that we've seen that are really interesting is as everybody knows, there's a lot of public dollars right now in education, and one of the major places that folks are putting those dollars based on research is in high dosage tutoring. And so that approach can actually help to shift the role of that teacher. In some places, the high dosage tutors are intentionally being built as a teacher pipeline program. And so there are some places where they're getting certification credits toward their teacher certification. They are being trained on the materials that the system uses. So it's not something that's just a tag along, it's actually an integral part of the education system, and they are being seen as kind of an extension of staff, not just these silos and satellites that sit outside of staffing. I think more to Frances's point, more PD that is really anchored on the student experience. So Frances and I both sit on the board of Stand for Children. Stand for Children is an advocacy organization, but they've also adopted some key programs, and one of them is really around looking at ninth grade on-track factors. So things that if you look at how a child is doing in ninth grade, you can pretty much determine whether or not they're going to graduate based on a set of indicators. And there is a program that has been based in the University of Chicago, very research-based, that STAND is now spreading across the country, where teachers sit around the table and they talk about individual students who might have an off-track indicator, and in doing so, they talk about how that student shows up in each of their classrooms. And so they're seeing the kid as a more of a holistic child, not just this is a kid who comes into my class and does X. And in so doing, they're swapping ideas and best practices at the individual child level. And then they're able to improve the outcomes for that child, but probably pay attention more across other children. And then there's some places where systems are partnering with other partners, like Kai Henderson used to be the chancellor of DC Public Schools, has started a phenomenal online tutoring program called Reconstruction. And she describes it as the equivalent for Black students of Hebrew school. And so it is high quality instructional content, and at the same time, and it's delivered by college students who again might become teachers. And at the same time, it is just affirming, engaging, and kids are getting a great content and great education. But systems are saying this is something we're paying for. Again, it's not an after school program as part of our core content, so that kids have more opportunities to cover the content that they may have missed during COVID. So we're seeing different ways that school systems are engaging with partners and thinking, although the whole time, about their long-term teacher pipelines. I
know I hadn't heard the term high dosage tutoring. High dosage tutoring, is that what is that?
It is, like 1-to-5 ratio, so many times a week, embedded in the day. There's a whole set of criteria of what it looks like.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it's sort of happening outside of the classroom, but really embedded into and closely linked to
the school day.
School. Yep.
Yeah. Chicago's running a major program. Tennessee, a lot of folks are spending their federal dollars on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Terrific. So I'm going to come back to you, Marlon, in a second, but I want to sort of, Frances had mentioned sort of early stage. And so I think asking about sort of what are some of those ideas that are most exciting that you're seeing, and you're investing in some of those very early stage ideas. What are some of the innovations you're seeing that you're excited about?
Yeah. A couple things, and I'll stay at the theme area because it always feels tough when you start mentioning certain organizations, but I'll probably mix the two. But one is, we have seen a major shift in the ideas that are coming to us, where we're seeing many more school models and many more learning solutions. And when I say that, I mean whether it's ed tech, content, or curriculum, focused on the intersection of academic and social emotional learning. There have been conversation about this for so many years, but for so long, we were either seeing people who are really good on the academic front or people who are really good on social emotional learning, but they were kind of like two different schools of thought, two different approaches. And now we're finally getting to the point right now where we're seeing ideas across our schools portfolio and our learning solutions portfolio where people are looking at the integration. And what's really exciting to me about that is the idea that I think we're getting to a point in the field where people understand that focusing on social emotional development is a way to improve academic results by ensuring that we're creating supportive learning environments where students feel like they're seen, they're understood, they're loved, where they're able to grow their growth mindset, explore their curiosity, understand their emotions in deeper ways. Like that is a way for us to get to improve student outcomes. And we're now seeing that show up in the ideas that are coming to us in a much deeper way. And that's something that really excites me. And I think the next forefront is like, how do we include mental health and well-being in that as well? So we're tending to the various needs that students have. The other thing that's really exciting to me, if I stick with schools, and again, we fund both charter schools and autonomous district schools. So as you were giving the overview, Christine, about charter schools, I was like, there are a number of innovative district schools that are adopting charter-like autonomies, and we can argue back and forth. Like, I think that's one of the ways in which the charter ideas have been spread and scaled, because we're now seeing districts saying, how do we best respond to the changing needs in our communities? How do we make sure that we are creating learning environments that are actually inspiring and compelling families to come and continue to come to us? And we're seeing tons of innovation. So that was a huge change, right? In terms of our own investment processes last year, 30% of the applications we received to our schools portfolio were from district schools, because districts are saying we need to have different approaches and we need to be more responsive. And we're really excited to follow that trend. And on that front, in our schools portfolio, what we found was that there were many more models that were focused on targeted student populations. How do I best support newcomers? How do I best support students who might identify as being LGBTQIA? How might we support students who are learning a new language? And this idea of targeted universalism, if you actually create a learning environment that best meets the needs of a specific group, you're actually going to develop new practices that are going to help us to serve all students well. And so really excited to see how that's been emerging as well as another trend. And I mentioned parents. Like, there are a number of ideas that we're starting to fund where parents, as I said, are full partners in the education of their child alongside teachers and other school systems leader. And so the idea that instead of kind of saying, hey, parents, drop them off and pick them up, that's all we need from you. The idea that like parents can truly extend the learning that's happening in the home, and kids are with their parents for significant amounts of time. Like, so we're seeing a lot more of efforts that are really focused on investing in parents to both understand, yes, the education system, to advocate for change, but then to say, how might we support you so that you can be an extension of what's happening in the school day, but also so that you can demand change. If your kid is not getting what they need, you now have seen what education is really like, and you're now in a position to actually advocate in much deeper ways. And so I think that is an incredibly powerful trend. I want to see how that continues to grow in a range of ways. So there's a couple of things that have me really excited right now.
Terrific. Well, I want to pick up on something you said and ask you, Marlon, sort of, I'm excited to hear that, we're starting to see not just charter schools, but autonomous district schools and districts getting involved, and sort of think, because if we were interested in system change, right, we need a lot of actors at the table. We need it coming from a lot of places. And so, Marlon, I mentioned from a systems perspective, like when you're thinking about cities, what are the levers that you have for change, and where do you see sort of these actors sort of, different schools coming together or not coming together? And so tell us a little bit about how you make it happen at the system level.
Yeah. And one more quick point. My colleagues here had some amazing innovations. And I will say one thing I just want to add really quickly to that I've seen in a lot of cities is, I think for our growth in the nonprofit / autonomous school sector was a lot of the larger CMOs, the KIPs. And I've seen recently a lot of just single site, one schools. In Denver here, a school that's going to go in front of the school board soon is the local Black Lives Matters chapter is launching a school. So I've also just seen a lot of innovation in terms of types of schools that are practicing a lot of these models, my colleague said, versus it just being in the larger school systems, but like individual schools try to meet individual needs for families. I've seen a lot more of that in the last 2 to 3 years than I saw previously in the movement. And I think that's a good thing, frankly, because it's just more options, the better. To your specific question, and this kind of ties into what Francis has said as well, too. There's a lot more parent advocacy in good ways and in challenging ways, but a lot more parent advocacy that's starting to happen at a local level. When I say challenging ways, I mean, I've seen a lot of misguided, again, critical race theory pushing in that nature. However, I have seen a lot more, particularly families of color, come together, organize, decide people want to run for school board, starting at a local level. I've seen school board races, which are generally very low turnout elections and still are as compared to House races, Senate races, obviously presidential elections. But you starting to see a slight rise in the number of people participating. And I think that's directly because more parents are getting engaged. They're getting their friends involved, but they're organizing on behalf of their families. A troubling trend to me that I'm hoping the parent engagement starts to help with is in many cities, because again, we work directly in many urban cores. So many cities, you have school districts that are 70, 80% kids of color. And the voting population is the complete opposite of that, with many kids don't actually have many parents don't actually have their kids in the public school system. So you have people voting for school board members that may not even participate in the actual school system. And the direct outcome of these elections are for largely kids of color who are in the system. And I think those trends are, again, not direct, it's going to take a long time, but you're starting to see, again, more parent advocacy, more folks, parents who are running for office. There's a gentleman here in Denver, African-American male, who's a teacher in a charter school, kids in the system, Gene Fashaw. He ran, he lost by that much, and he's preparing to run again in 4 years. So that type of energy, I think, is the change we're talking about. When we think about system change, it starts with who's making these decisions that are benefiting our kids. It's the school board. It's bringing more, again, the board I serve on here in Denver for a charter school. It's have folks like me, but have folks who are direct parents in that school system. So it's getting more parents engaged, both not only from the advocacy standpoint, but ultimately in these leadership positions and making decisions that are best for their children, which I think for a while you didn't see a lot of given the voting trends, but I think that's slowly starting to shift.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. So I'll go back to you for a second, Francis, on that, because I think thinking about getting people engaged, you mentioned participatory grant making. And I was curious what that looked like and how you were, it sounded like that's a new thing that you're doing. So I wanted to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, happy to share more. And it's a new thing that we're doing, and we're learning a lot by stepping into it. And I would not say that we are expert on it. I think, so let me just tell you what we've been doing and maybe some of what we've been learning. So what we did last year is we launched a new, it was a $1.5 million investment fund, and we were testing two different things. One was, we believe that we are so far from having an excellent and equitable education system, particularly when you think about on the equity piece, racial equity. And so we were saying, as we looked at our investment strategy, yes, we have schools, yes, we have learning solutions, yes, we have a focus on diverse leadership. There were a lot of things that we were not focused on. So what would it look like if we were to launch a broad-based fund where we were not narrowing what we were going to support, but we said, bring us your best ideas for how we get to a more racially just system. The other thing we did is we said we're only going to fund leaders of color, and we were only going to fund brand new organizations, not like new initiatives within an existing organization. And we were going to have a council of 13 students, parents, and education leaders who were mostly outside of our portfolio, people who we were not directly funding, to make all the decisions. And so what we did is we did a broad-based application for all of our grant making. We do applications where anyone can apply to us. So last year we got 1,300 applications across all of our investment areas, and 315 specifically to this racial equity fund. And essentially we delivered those applications to the council. What we said was we did some high-level paring down. But the group reviewed the vast majority of the applications developed an investment criteria to decide what did they want to fund, what did they view as really advancing racial equity. And in the group, they came together to consider all the different applications and eventually decided to fund 10 organizations who each received $150,000. And these are folks who are in the earliest stages. Some are still creating their strategic plans. Some are just starting to pilot their work and getting the work off the ground. What I thought was really interesting from the process was that the kind of criteria that the council was putting forward was different. They were really trying to interrogate, I think, the mindsets and the orientations of the founders to really understand what is their deep commitment to racial equity and the ongoing work that they need to do. They really wanted to make sure that there was clear evidence of community need and community demand for the ideas that were coming forward. That it's not just someone's great idea, but that there was a clear sense of how this was going to have an impact and that others were asking for this particular thing. And I thought it was interesting too, because, and this is something I want to interrogate a lot more, there were also different biases that were brought up by the council. For example, if someone had a lot of what you would say were kind of credentials, kind of went to an Ivy League institution, viewed as more privileged than others, right? The idea was like, do they really need this fund? We want to view this as a way to expand access to maybe those who haven't had it before. And so it's interesting too, how the group was coming together and how they were defining different things. Again, I'm sharing this as information. I'm not, putting a judgment on it, but more to say, like, it was having us to think a lot more about how we think about our own criteria. I'd say moving forward, we want to make sure that we're spending a lot more time with the council up front, doing a lot more grounding. Folks really wanted to think about disrupting philanthropy as a whole, not just this assignment of allocating the $1.5 million fund, because they were saying we see a lot of things wrong and there's a lot of things we want to change. And so for us, it's kind of like, how do we make space for both that and then the ongoing work of allocating dollars? How do we make sure we're doing a lot more work up front and grounding in philanthropy and grounding in the racial inequities where everyone feels like they can come together and make strong decisions? And also, to do this work well, it requires deep trust and moving slowly through each stage of the process. And I think one of the things that we didn't do right is we moved quickly because we believe in piloting things, that sometimes the best learning you do is the learning you do while trying to figure it out. But I do wish we would have gone back in time and actually stage this out a little bit more, because I think we didn't know what we didn't know until we jumped in and got started. And so I'm really excited for like kind of the next round of it and the slower, more deliberate approach we're going to take.
Thank you. That sort of it's fascinating, both on the piloting and what we would call the co-production side, right? And how that changes the criteria themselves. And I mean, in some sense, of course that happens, but you don't know what those in some sense, you don't know what those criteria will be, all the surprising things we learn when you sort of basically hand it over and say, okay, what are you going to come up with? So I think that's a fascinating experiment, and glad to hear what you're learning about it. Julie, I don't know what the equivalent is for you, but thinking about sort of this equity, thinking about I think the term you used the other day, equitable design. I don't know exactly what that means, if that's related in the right way to what we're talking about. But sort of, can you join this conversation too? Because I think it's super intriguing.
Yeah, and I love learning from Frances. We're really trying to understand where we're going to fall on what she described as participatory grant making. Our potential, like, different ways of doing funding have been, I would point to 3, and the third I'll end with equitable design, because I think has the most to say about that. One is that we fund organizations like EdLock, which is Education Leaders of Color, that has their own Boulder Fund, where we are giving funds to an organization that we know is going to find and support entrepreneurs that we never would, and specifically leaders of color, to Frances's point about getting more funds to leaders of color because of the proximity of their experience to the students that we're trying to serve. So that's one thing that we've done during the first half, if you will, of COVID, the early months of COVID. We actually put out over $50 million in direct cash to people. So this is a time when stimulus dollars were not going to people who are undocumented, when it was not sufficient dollars, that we just pretty quickly ramped up. We ramped up one thing called Give Directly that ended up, we seeded it with 30. We ended up raising 200 million to do direct cash, with the idea that, to Francis's point, people know what they need most, where those dollars are. We also simultaneously ran a study on it that the final results will be published soon. And people spent their money on school supplies for kids, on rent, on food. And it really flies in the face, I think, of the belief, I think, by too many folks with money who think people who will have money will waste it. Like, we can't really trust them. It's ultimately what Francis is talking about. What I think direct cash giving is all about is you trust people to make good decisions. And there's a lot of philanthropy that frankly doesn't do that. We also fund people who are on their path to becoming a teacher, but may need a little help over that summer before becoming a teacher. We don't want to lose them, especially teachers of color. And then equitable design, to your point, and this came up in the chat about innovative uses of funds. I would say the process can be the innovation, and I would anchor on equitable design. So we saw in some of our systems that we had been working with over about 18 months, an approach to their response to COVID that for the first time really centered community voice and the voice of the folks most furthest from opportunity or most marginalized, to say what were their needs and how would they meet them, and to be able to build that into the process, which is different than a school system doing community input. This is really seeking out who are the kids that are disengaging? Who are the parents that don't have internet access? How do we solve their problems? Because to Francis's point about if you solve for those problems, then you're going to solve everybody else's problems as well. And so what we're seeing, and we're seeing this more, and we're actually building it into our grants now, is support for both nonprofits and districts to have some training about how to really engage with equitable design by listening to people who are most marginalized by their systems and have not been successful, so that then they can design to meet those needs.
And so Marlon, how about how about you and how you think about sort of funding? Has that changed over the last couple of years in terms of what you're investing in? And
not as directly as them. It has changed a little bit for sure. Again, mostly what we do is we resource local organizations who I think they changed the way the resources that coming from us have gone out.
Yeah.
So the local C3s that are helping to incubate and open schools, I think are still doing that, but are looking at, I think definitely have a different layer of lens of equitable lens in terms of how they're giving out locally. Talent has been a really big, and my colleagues here have talked about that, but how are we recruiting a diverse workforce that look like the students we aim to serve? I think that lens has been heightened in the last couple of years as well too. So I think our local organizations are definitely doing that. We have internal goals on making sure that we are funding not just leaders, but leaders of color that again look like these the communities that we aim to serve. So I say that's been something that has, again, nothing that has been changed directly, but something that I think has been we're more deliberate in ways that we probably weren't 2 to 3 years ago. It's something that was always a goal of ours, but I think we are way more deliberate about it. So our funding model, et cetera, like itself has not changed. I think the ways that our local organizations are using funds have changed. One thing I think that I'm starting to think about at our work is, given everything that is going on, again, we fund mostly in 15 cities and they're looking to expand across the country. In many of these cities, you actually are seeing enrollment decline. You are seeing population, people either moving in, and then those who are lower to middle income moving out in many of these urban areas across the country. And so my big question as we think about the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years is, where are the kids who need us going to be? Again, I'll use Denver as an example. You're seeing people move out of Denver into like Aurora, a suburb of Denver. And so we can do all this great Denver work and we need to do it, but also are we going to do all this great work and ultimately the kids are going to be somewhere else. So I'm trying to remind ourselves, how do we look at that and make sure our funding is not just for now, but thinking 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and starting to look at these trips as birth rates are starting to decline, people are starting to move, and frankly, gentrification is happening in many of these urban areas, and making sure that we are still serving the kids that need us the most.
Yeah, that's a great point. We think about scaling and growing, and you grow here, and then the kids go there. Then how do you adapt to that? So I guess we're gonna open up to questions in about 5 minutes. So if you have questions, you're gonna can raise your hand. You can put them in the chat. We will start to do that in just a moment. So I wanted to ask a little bit about the constraints, sort of the where you see the big constraints in where we are in terms of sort of really trying to move the needle and system change. I mean, we've talked about a number of different things. Where we started off talking about politics. We've got sort of we've got issues around teachers, and do we have enough teachers? So I'm sort of curious in your experiences, what do you see as the constraints to making the kind of change you want to see? What are the ones you are worried most about right now?
So first of all, to say, and I'm sure we'll all say the same thing, like I recognize I sit in an incredibly privileged place, right? So I think about the constraints. I think about the fact that here in Oakland, which is where I live, the superintendent is concerned with where are her kids, how, like to the point earlier, who has lost somebody that's close to them, what's happening with evictions, what's happening with just the basic fundamentals of being able to deliver an education. And how do you make sure all the trains are running on time when there's not enough people? Like this, we talk about this, but these are the constraints, right? Like there's not enough people. This is the first time, and I've talked to other funders who we fund districts, we fund charters, we fund states. We're kind of agnostics. We go where the kids are. We're having a hard time like getting school system leaders' attention because they're the people out in the schools because there aren't enough teachers, because they're being asked to spend these amazing buckets of dollars super fast without any planning, under constraints of like, we got to fix our HVAC systems. We got to do all this stuff. We got to make sure kids are masked. We got to respond to school boards. We got to see if our books are the right books. And by the way, you got to get results in 3 years and make sure you spent them well, because if not, you're going to be held accountable, right? Like it is, on the one hand, it is such an amazing gift for these resources to be flowing. The constraints of those dollars are actually quite stressful in some cases. And, it's like it's a good burden to have. But systems don't have extra people right now to run around and like figure these things out. So some of the things we're doing is trying to like fund extra people to be in the school system to try to alleviate some of those conditions, and just people who can, like we do on a day-to-day basis, have the ability to look up and say, oh, look what's happening. Jason Cameras over in Richmond is using his funds. And again, you got to use these for one time. The unions are saying, use these to hire people. 3 years, the funds go away. You got a lot of people you got to fire, right? So use them for one-time hits. It's like Jason Cameras is saying, I know that we know how to teach reading well. It's called the science of reading. There are 4 parts of the brain. You got to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to make sure that all of my elementary school teachers have the opportunity to be trained in the science of reading. And if you're not, over these next 3 years, I'm going to make that massive investment. If you're not, you can't teach elementary school anymore in Richmond, right? So how do we take that idea? And Christine, to your point earlier, how do you diffuse it? How do you make sure that that is getting spread? So I think one of the constraints is just not being able to look around and have the capacity to do that, and then be able to implement well at a time when you're trying to implement in a very vastly reduced, constrained environment, which is why I think these partnerships with things like Reconstruction, with out-of-school time providers, are super important as ways to work around those constraints towards changing what's happening in a meaningful way for young people.
Well said. Thank you. Yeah. Francis?
I don't have much to add. I just want to say +1 to Julie. I think you covered it. The only thing is like, we're not out of the woods with COVID either. Like I keep thinking about like, what are the additional surges going to be moving forward? And how are we moving, back and forth nimbly between in-person, hybrid, or other setups? Like we're not out of the woods. And I think we are operating as though we are. The only thing I would add to the list of worries that you mentioned as you talked about superintendents is just kind of, we've heard very vulnerably in different settings from superintendents who have talked about the fact that they can't do all those strategic initiatives they might want to, because they're dealing with, let's say anti-masking, anti-CRT, the politics of their school boards, right? And so my worry right now is that we're going to look back at this time at both the burning platform for innovation and a need for new ideas, and that we just didn't have the bandwidth and the ability to actually focus on it because of a lack of people, lack of attention, and because we were focused on the wrong issues and we're having the wrong conversation that was taking us away from what we needed to talk about. So those are the only things I would add, but I think Julie beautifully covered everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we have a moment where so social innovation in some ways more more needed than ever, but not the time and attention and people to be able to focus on it.
And you know, we've long said, well, it's money. We don't have money. Now money is not the problem. Now it's the people, it's the strategic and implementation capacity, the ability to identify the bold moves, and having a set of providers and partners who are well positioned and to provide the support so that you can actually move on those quickly. Those are the bigger issues that we're grappling with too. I think the other thing we didn't talk as much about, I'll just say is, I also think this is a moment where we could be thinking about, you know, school and the school system no longer as being the primary way of teaching and thinking about teaching and learning, right? We have also seen, and Julie alluded to this a bit, of like, in some ways, community, like learning happening within community and happening within community institutions. Students in some ways, when they have support, being able to stitch together a learning experience that's truly going to meet their needs. And so the thing that I keep thinking about is like, what if we followed some of those threads? Where would that take us? But when you talk about barriers and you talk about constraints, everything would need to be different. Everything would need to be different. And that just feels like an insurmountable set of questions to be considering right now.
Yeah, Marlon, you want to jump in here?
I mean, I started it with politics, and again, that's my background. So that's where my head always goes. And our country is so polarized that any types of system change, whether it be education or anything else, is just really, really hard. And because it's immediate distraction from what could be to like something that is a dog whistle. And so it's just immediate distractions for political gain. And so that's my worry, is that, because I do think we are in a window, like who knows? I agree with Francis that we will probably still ebb and flow with this pandemic. However, the beginning of this pandemic won't happen again, at least in the same way. And I say it because it just opened up a major window for drastic systems change. If you look at drastic system change at any level throughout the history of this country, it needed something major to happen. You look at the civil rights movement, Bloody Sunday needed to happen to wake America up, to say that is not okay. And obviously we still have a lot of systemic problems from that, but that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. So things like, we have a moment with this pandemic, and I worry we will miss it because we're going to get distracted on issues that are not like true systems change to actually make our education system better. We're going to get distracted. And that's my concern in terms of this disruption. And hopefully we as philanthropy can help guide our dollars to those that need it. I love the participatory grant making components that was mentioned. And hopefully the resources that we can provide can hopefully try to help keep some focus. But I do worry in general about the politics being a distraction.
Yeah, so I certainly agree with you, Marlon, on all sorts of fronts, education just being one. That sort of we have this moment for all sorts of change, and I've been disappointed more than I've been thrilled in too many instances. So please put your questions in the chat, folks. I'm gonna ask one of Jamie Estrada has a question here, and it's gonna turn us to get a little more hopeful. I mean, so her question here is about, you know, the major innovations that have happened and taken hold. You know, everything from school governance to project and mastery-based learning, micro schools. I'm gonna to split her question into two, but sort of, if you had a magic wand, right? If you could just make something diffuse. You know, what are those educations that we have and we know are good that you would want to really, you know, to see, not constrained by, you know, as you said, Francis, sort of the interdependent and embedded system, and with it is very hard to actually move. Yeah. So what would your magic wand send around?
Probably not a surprise to everybody. I'll go right to the heart of teaching. One of the innovations we've seen lately is that folks are saying one of the ways to make the teaching role a lot more doable is to make sure there's a high quality instructional material as the spine. And so teachers are not being asked every night to do a lesson plan, but instead you are modifying what is already good, that there are teacher communities built around that for a lot of, you know, support and help. So if I had to wave a magic wand, it would be around ensuring teachers had the resources that they needed, like high quality instructional materials, so that and other types of resources, so that when they are standing up in front of a teacher and in front of the classroom, they are really focusing on the individual student level, not on the production of the content that then becomes what the students experience. And then alongside of that, though, we have seen a lot of innovations in professional development. It's not the case anymore where folks just sit, 100 to a room and get some kind of professional development. You see a lot more teacher to teacher, viral type of professional development building, and teachers as the experts to share and to anchor on student work. So again, it's something that may not seem too sexy, but as teachers step into the role of really helping each other to become a learning environment amongst their colleagues, we've just seen that really improve what instruction looks like.
Marlon or Francis, you have a magic wand, Hope?
I love what she said. My magic wand is I pay teachers. I would support them. Francis said it best. We're asking teachers to do like 8 jobs now. Teach, be a mental health professional, like so many different things we're asking. So how do we support them with other staff that can take over the roles so they can teach? And then lastly, I was a believer in autonomous schools prior to the COVID. I'm way more a believer as we are in the middle, or hopefully on the other side of this pandemic. The ability for nonprofit boards to govern and be nimble, but also be able to be steady at the same time. I think it's been great, and not get caught up in the whims of the politics that are happening. So that's obviously an innovation that's happened for a while, but the ability to continue to just expand nonprofits, I just think will continue to make our school systems better and better.
Love all this. I feel like I want to plus one so many things, but I'll take a slightly different tact here. As you were starting at the beginning, Christine, talking about how innovation can both be in terms of like idea, like model, process, right? There's all kinds of ways for us to think about innovation. I would say on this one, I want to focus on a process innovation, which is, I think, the ways in which we create ideas, which needs to be much more rooted in community-based design, right? We are long from, well, maybe we're not. Let me say this differently. We should no longer kind of adopt a missionary mindset as we think about change efforts in communities across this country. And so what that means is that we need to start by understanding the assets, the aspirations, and the dreams of those we seek to serve: the students, the families, any other relevant community members. And if you start with that, and you start with that insight, and you start with valuing the people in that community and designing from them, and from that starting place, as opposed to, here's my idea, now I need to find a place where I can impose it. Oftentimes working on grass tops as opposed to thinking about what the grassroots need. I feel like that innovation, which we have seen, I think has led to much more sustainable and durable ideas who have the buy-in, and where we're actually able to see the results play out over time. And that can be applied to a range of ideas, but we're not seeing that approach nearly enough. And I think that's what it's going to take for us to get to a much more equitable system.
Yeah, which is why I was so excited to hear you say that 70% of those investments being invested in people of color. That's a big change in the space. So I teach social innovation and social entrepreneurship. And what you said is that's how you describe most of social entrepreneurship is I've got an idea. I'm gonna and that shift, right, that you're talking about not being your idea, but sort of listening and learning from the local community. I think that is something that we are much too late to start thinking about, but does feel like a real sea change in how people are starting to think about what it means to innovate and what's required.
And let's be clear, we still need innovators to come up with incredible ideas, because sometimes we don't know what's possible and we can't imagine an alternative future and an alternative set of outcomes. So we still need the genius that comes from coming up with a new idea. But I think the difference is who wants it? Does anyone want that idea, right? Is that an idea that matches a felt need, like an aspiration, a hope, right? And I think it's about that match that we need to really be focused on, as opposed to something being done in isolation and being imposed.
Right. And I think when you move to social entrepreneurship away from regular entrepreneurship, that the market usually would tell you what that is. right? No, is there anyone that wants to buy it? But our this space doesn't operate in that with that same clarity. So figuring out who wants it is a slightly more complicated question. So there's a couple of really good questions in here. So I'm going to start with Brian Lynn's, and then I'm going to go back to Michael's, just to Marlon. This question seems like for you to start us off with, at least, right? But if moving the needle in schools requires political will, what's your approach to navigating such a visible surge of strong will pushing back against equity, and in some cases turning over entire school boards in order to silence marginalized voices and uphold oppressive policies?
Great question. Something I think about often. I'll say a few things. One is, I think the nonprofit autonomous school charter space, all those things, is getting more diverse, but has a ways to go. And I say that because I think what's really important is to have a very clear message of what we stand for, and then to have very specific messengers that are out there delivering that clear message. And what I found in my time in politics, even before I was in education, is there is a subset of folks that are just very, and it can be very negative, right? There's two things that make us, I think, tick as humans: hope and fear. And a lot of times people play to our fear, particularly in the social media day and age. And this is very easy to have a very fearful message, make us scared, make us react. The same messengers, generally those messages are tinged with race baiting, and move forward. I think until we have very consistently, and I think we're getting better at this, but have a ways to go, people of color talking about choice, talking about the school systems that benefit them, out there doing it all the time. And we as funders need to be funding efforts that are lifting that up. The media will continue to just focus on this other narrative because it's just easy to focus on, because it gets clicks and it gets more profit, right? So we are living with this, all this media components are also part of just what's going to drive attention that will continue to make the media get profit. So now I'm going on a tangent because I think about this all the time, but I do think clear message, a values-based message that will hit people's heartstrings. We, the three of us and others, can get deep into the policy, and parents should be front and center of that. From a messaging standpoint, people don't want to hear the very specific policy outcomes. What they want to hear, what is this school going to do for me? What is this system doing for me? How is this helping me? And we need to be very clear about that and make sure that people saying that message looks, again, like the communities we want to serve. And that's the best way we can push back against what I will say is the other crazy stuff that's happening on the message standpoint.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up there just to build it, what Marlon is saying. So we've been very much involved in the politics of this, rates right in the heart of it. And so looking at serious messaging research and finding, and this just played out actually in New Hampshire, where New Hampshire was the first place they did the $500 if you turn in a teacher. There are some policies that we know are being tried in certain places and then replicated in others. New Hampshire just had a school board election, 300 seats were open. And what we saw across that was based on messaging research. We know that if we talk to people's values, to Marlon's point, and if you get underneath the fear-based content, that actually the values-based content resonates with folks from across, except for people who are way out on the fringe. And that can turn folks to say, oh no, this is the type of education that I want for my kids. Even when you think about things if you talk about an accurate history, that has overwhelming support from folks all across all parts of the political spectrum. So there's content messaging that has been done and now is being used in political races. And so far we're seeing that in that place and others. There's efforts to either kill or weaken the bills that are going on. And there's just a lot of coalitions of both grassroots organizations as well as organizations who are more involved in with other types of stronger political associations, if you will. And then there's also work to support and defend teachers. So everything from legal defense funds for teachers, because teachers are in need of those, unfortunately, right now, helping teachers understand what can be taught in places where, like Oklahoma, where these bans have been passed. And then to Marlon's point, also pivoting to say, what's the new narrative? How do we define a narrative that's based on equity? And to Marlon's point, who are the messengers? And so there's an active set of activities that are being orchestrated across education now more and more with other people in the specifically the Democratic Party. But it really gets down to what Heather McGhee would say is a solidarity dividend, that racism hurts us all. And if we think about coming together on commonly shared values, it's going to be beneficial to all students in our future.
Frances, I'll let you answer that if you'd like to, but I have a different question from Michael here that sort of picks up a little bit on sort of your thought about, gosh, could we just reimagine the whole thing? And Marlon's point about sort of the declining enrollments in places. So Michael asked, should we be taking advantage of declining enrollment to bring social services and other supports onto school campuses? Is this a moment to reimagine what happens on a school site and how schools are a locus for community?
Yeah, when I first saw your question, Michael, the first thing that came to mind is like, I feel like, at least in our portfolio, I'm going to focus my comments on our portfolio. We have over 90 schools that are open and operating across the country. They're doing this right now, and they had been doing it. We also provide, emergency relief funding during the pandemic, as an example. And you know what the money went to? It went to buying hotspots. It went to buying access to internet. It went to buying grocery cards. It went to Uber rides to take people to and from medical appointments. And what we're finding is that, and I think this was, kind of front and center and goes back to a point that Julie made at the top of like, how interconnected all the different sectors are, particularly you start focusing on the student and you start focusing on the family. You're saying, how do we bring all those supports together? And schools have been the first line of defense for so many students, for so many families. And I think we're seeing those shifts already take place. Now, the question is like, is there going to be the money and the support in a long-term sustainable fashion so that schools continue to show up this way? And also, can we continue to ask schools to take this on? I feel like so many of the models, like whether they're kind of more like promise neighborhood models or even models that are thinking more about like community development, where they're thinking about schools and medical centers, childcare, workforce development. Like those are some of the best innovations that we've seen that bring that multi-sectoral approach. But what I like about those approaches too, it doesn't put all the onus on the school, because the thing that I'm really worried about is, again, this theme we keep on talking about, we keep asking teachers to do more, we keep asking school leaders to do more, and the school leader can't do everything. The teacher can't do everything. So I just wonder, how might we think about some of those other kind of multi-sector innovations as we think about tackling these issues moving forward? And there are great examples of that across the country.
Yeah, I just want to double down on the last point on the multi-sector. At some point, we have asked schools again to do so much, for starting with teachers and then the school. And while we are in a great resource perspective now, who knows how long that lasts, particularly with declining enrollment. So I love the idea of like, how do the school systems partner with other sectors in the community to create, something larger. So if something happens, it's like, okay, and I'm going to work with this person on the mental health side. And that way our kids are getting the mental health services they need. And frankly, I believe in community. So the more that we are operating from a community standpoint, supporting our schools and teaching, working with different sectors of the community, I just think that's going to be a very powerful thing. And I think you're seeing some innovations around the country with that, but I think the more that we lift that up and test those models, I think it could be stronger. So I just want to double down on that. I think it could be a really good way to, and again, using this moment as a way to really think about new systems is a good chance to practice and try those things out in different places.
Yeah, it's great. Terrific. I'm sort of struck by how sort of this whole idea that schools should be the center of all sorts of services like that's an idea that's been around for a long, long time. People have tried it in all sorts of places, and I don't know, has it not stuck because it doesn't work? Has it not stuck because of a lack of political will? So I'm sort of curious a little bit about how do we, so sort of pivoting a little bit to part of Jamie's question that I didn't get to, which is how do we know what works? And sort of what are the ways that you sort of track and think about sort of evidence and knowing what is worth investing in? And, you know, I know that because it works isn't often enough to make it actually stick. That it would be nice if that was all that it would take. But I'm sort of curious how you think about data and evidence and tracking and really knowing what works and doesn't work. I know it's probably fundamental to a lot of what you do.
If you don't mind, I'm going to start, and I actually probably need to jump after that. I'm sorry to jump like a few minutes early, but I'm getting removed from the building I'm in. Which means I probably won't have internet. But I'll try to join my phone in a second if I can as well too. One of the things we do, there's several research organizations, one like Credo, for example, and we look at the cities that we're in, one, how the nonprofit sector is performing relative to the district as a whole, but then two, how the nonprofit and the district is performing relative to the state, and are we closing gaps with the state, right? Because in many urban cities, the performance in cities is lower than the statewide performance overall. So we look and see if we're closing those gaps. And in many of the places where you see an expanding nonprofit sector, you see that gap closing. We also, one of the measures we use right now is free and reduced lunch. And one of the questions we're having internally is that the best measure to really track the kids that we care about and the kids that we're aiming to serve? And I'm curious what my colleagues say here, because the hard part is I'm not sure what other measures there are that is, you know, you have in every single place where you can kind of do comparison to really know that's the best measure. So, but it is a question we're having in terms of that measure itself. But, you know, I think one of the things you can think about in terms of if you're trying new innovations is really, I love tracking against the state, because I think that's just a relatively, I wouldn't say stable, but for lack of better words, I'm going to say stable baseline where you can look to see like, okay, based on the state, we're starting to grow here and we're starting to grow here based on the innovation you're trying to do. But I do have a question about what is the best factor to really think about the kids that we aim to serve. And again, right now we have a measure that's not perfect, but we're trying to think about what else we can do there. And it's been a joy to be with you guys today. And I'm sorry again to probably bug off a little early. I'll stay on as long as I can. But this has been awesome. And I'd love to follow up anyone if anyone have questions.
Terrific. Thanks, Marlon. Yeah, same question for both you, Julian, and Francis, actually. I sort of think, you know, we talk a lot about metrics and how we know, and, you know, in this space, it's critical, you know, to a lot, to your work, I imagine. So how do you think about it?
I saw you were motioning, Julie. Were you about to say something? Go ahead, go for it.
Yeah.
Flip a coin, right? Okay, so I put the context out that I think as funders, we have to be super humble, right? Like we can contribute support to various pieces of what the factors that go into a student's success. I think about it as a spoke on the wheel. Like, you know, I do a lot of cycling, and like every spoke has to be true. We're only going to be able to affect a couple of them. So we look at metrics and outcomes with a large dose of humility and more of a learning stance to understand how are we advancing learning in grantees and then in the field, more so than kind of metrics of sharp accountability. We also know that these systems have been designed, the systems to get the outputs that they've been designed to get, and undoing that is a pretty monumental task. And what we want to avoid is the whiplash of like, oh, something's not working yet, so let's go do something else in the flavor of the day. So how do we think about this long-term while we still have short-term indicators? And so the ones that we're looking at most intensely are changes in teacher practice, and UVA is helping us to validate a tool that has centering equity, but looking at what are the changes that teachers are making in their behavior as a result of some of the interventions that we are funding. And then also student experience, because it doesn't, you know, to some extent, doesn't matter if the teacher practice is changing if the student experience is not one that aligns with their success and what they're experiencing. So so we're looking at a lot of student surveys and supporting grantees to design, develop, or use theirs, and not trying to do one size fits all as well, because that again would serve us and not the grantees. And ultimately, our focus is to get our grantees and others in the field smarter and not so much focus on what happens back at Schusterman. The other thing I will say is we are involved, like I think the systems that we have right now for accountability and then the individual assessments are about to undergo a major shift. And so we're involved with some funding of new models of assessments, and are trying to figure out how can we as funders be involved in the conversation about what does it mean to shift accountability systems, and how do you do so in a way that's based in community definitions of success.
What's motivating that change, Julie? That change?
I mean, I think that, I would argue that the assessments and accountability systems we have now are a whole lot better than where they were before, because we had no visibility into how students, especially students who were not performing well, were doing. And so there's been a marked improvement in transparency, but we can all think of 5 reasons why standardized assessments that we sat through aren't great at assessing learning. And so there's, if it's everything from tying it more directly to instruction, making sure that, can kids have text on a test that they've been exposed to rather than as an equity play? Like, there's a range of different types of modifications that you can make to assessments to still produce results on student learning, but to make them more effective, to be a part of the instructional improvement and educational improvement cycle.
A couple things I'd add there. Agree with much of what you said, Julie. And the other thing I would add is just like, we need to think about assessment separate from accountability too. I think we need to evolve kind of how we are doing assessments so that they can actually inform what is happening in the day-to-day experience of the classroom. And we need to expand what we're measuring, right? So like, for example, in our schools portfolio, we are measuring proficiency, we are measuring growth. We think growth is the best indicator as we think about kind of students who might have been furthest behind, really having the opportunity to accelerate their learning to catch up. And we have a number of student surveys that we use to help school leaders and educators to understand the experiences that students are having in terms of their social emotional development, in terms of whether or not they view their classroom as a supportive learning environment. And like, the last thing we'd want to do is to then kind of start to use those things in an accountability system, because then those things can become weaponized. And the thing that we think is most important is like, how do we find ways to really understand how students are experiencing their education, so that we can ensure that there are no gaps in terms of certain students feeling like they're well set up for success, where others feel like they're furthest behind. Those are really helpful tools that can be used by school leaders as they're thinking about making adjustments, as they're thinking about continuous improvement, but don't necessarily have to find their ways in an accountability system. So I do think how we separate those things, I think is going to be really, really important. The other thing is I'd add on this topic is, as early stage funders, we recognize that most of the folks that we're supporting do not have strong logic models and do not have strong impact measurement approaches. And we provide, yes, funding, but also management assistance and technical support. And one of the places where we put a lot of our dollars is actually in providing consulting support to each of our organizations to be able to develop their measurement approach. Then what we say is, how do we look across a portfolio and then aggregate up the data that we know is being measured, but that those measurements, as Julie was saying, are being driven by what those individual leaders think are most important for them to have the information they need to advance their ideas, right? And so we are in a place where we need to be led by the folks that we're funding, but then also using that, because as an intermediary, we're raising money too. We need to make sure that we're able to understand the health and the strength of our portfolios as well. And so there's a tension and a bit of a dance, but we believe that we need to be on the leading edge of also creating a set of new measures so that we have a way of pushing more broadly on the field on this topic as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, terrific. So I mean, you use the word portfolio, and I guess thinking also not just about the ventures, but about your organizations, right? How do you not all of your venture, in venture capital, right? You don't need all of your ventures to be successful to feel successful. How do you think about that as an organization and your own performance?
Yeah. We believe, especially when you're in the earliest stages of supporting organizations and leaders, that investing is more art than science. We have investment criteria. So for example, we're looking at the idea. Do we believe it's an idea that's going to drive improved student outcomes, improved experiences for leaders or educators they're serving? We're looking at strength of the team. We're looking at kind of what are the plans for impact? What are the plans for growth and sustainability? And I want to be careful. Growth is not the traditional way of talking about scaling. I think one of the biggest ways in which we've seen shifts in philanthropy, it's like impact doesn't have to equal more. It doesn't have to equal expansion and direct replication, but there's a range of ways to really ensure that best practices are being taken up and that they're spread. And so we're looking at that broad definition of that. We're also looking at community demand, community support, community involvement in the ideas. But it's not a check the box exercise where you're just saying like, okay, this one, gets an A+ on all those things. We know that we have to take risks because we need new ideas. If there were all the silver bullets and all we needed to do was just to spread and scale them, then we would have solved all these problems. Instead, I think we actually need fundamentally different ideas, and we won't know if all of them work out. And we're also expanding access to capital, expanding access to who gets to be a social entrepreneur. And so what that also means is that if there are certain people who have been left behind, folks are going to come to us with ideas with maybe different levels of readiness that are more of a reflection, not of their brilliance and of their idea and their vision, but a reflection of access to networks, access to certain kind of training, and yes, access to capital. So how do we then kind of look at a range of factors to then say, who do we take a bet on? And I believe in our portfolios, like, I don't have it's not a hard and fast rule. Is it 10 to 20% of the ideas might be quote unquote riskier, where we're not as sure if they're going to play out. Another 10 to 20% might be, funding ideas that are just something we've never even seen before. And again, we're kind of going to follow where that goes. But we believe, given where we fund it, we are creating a funnel for all the other kind of education funders to then be able to kind of pick up the strongest from our portfolio. So it's incumbent on us to think about taking these risks so that it's a part of our core value proposition. And I believe it's the way that we're actually going to get to a much more excellent and equitable system.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Frances. Thank you, Julie, for joining us today. I mean, I think it was a really interesting conversation around social innovation to really understand the moment we've been in and still are in, and how that creates both some opportunities and challenges. And I learned a lot from our conversation. I know that our participants did it as well. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your time. And thanks everyone for joining us.